All right. Thank you very much, Samir. Now we're recording Philosophy of Fitness Revisited. Thank you so much, Samir.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas, for the kind introduction and for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Just trying to angle this so people can see a bit better. Okay. So the title of my talk then is The Philosophy of Fitness Revisited. Sorry, am I blocking the screen for you? You can see? You sure? Do you want me to try and move this a bit over? Okay, so the themes of my talk then, firstly, the fitness concept in evolutionary biology, the discussions of this concept in philosophy and in biology, the sort of somewhat problematic nature of the philosophical literature on this, in my opinion, and a new way forward that I have to suggest, which involves sort of deploying two ideas that are familiar from the general philosophy of science, developed for other purposes, for understanding or trying to understand some of the controversy that has surrounded this this concept. Sorry, I'm in trouble here getting rid of
This dog here.
Yeah, there's some interference on my screen. How do I get rid of that?
Oh, yeah.
It's nice to see people, but I don't want them in the way of my slides.
Let's people here then. Yeah, we should probably hide this. Masquer les commandes flottantes and this, and then probably this.
Yeah, perfect.
Good.
Okay. So themes continue. Where was I? How do I go back? Right. Good idea. Okay. Yeah. So, those two ideas from the general philosophy of science that I want to employ. Firstly, the notion of a theoretical concept. I want to suggest that fitness is one of those, and a particular approach to understanding theoretical concepts in science associated with the names of Ramsey, Carnap, and Lewis. In 20th century, big names in 20th century philosophy of science, of course. And second general idea is the model first view of science, the notion that a scientific theory is best thought of as a sort of family of related models rather than a sort of set of laws of nature that you might model as an axiomatic system or something like that. Again, familiar to many philosophy of science people. So then this label, the philosophy of fitness, that I put in scare quotes, this was actually a disparaging label that was given to the nascent discipline of philosophy of biology back in the 1970s by people who felt that philosophers of biology seemed to spend all their time going on about fitness to the exclusion of other supposedly more interesting things. And to me, you see that complaint missed the point, because the real puzzle, I think, is not why people talked about it so much, but why they talked about it at all. That's to say, it really isn't obvious why the fitness concept should be thought amenable to or in need of philosophical analysis. By sharp contrast with other topics in evolutionary biology where the philosophical dimension is really clear. If you think of, say, the question of what a species is, or the nature of teleology or something, discussions that have clear Aristotelian roots. So the reasons that we might, as philosophers, have cared about them, thought we had something good to say about them, are obvious. But the definition of fitness, really? This could be a topic for philosophical discussion. Why so? I'll say a little bit about why people came to think that in due course. But for the moment, I'll say it's not obvious. However, philosophical work on fitness, in fact, sort of burgeoned and still goes on a lot. But to my mind, it's somewhat unproblematic in a number of respects. One is it's not really always clear what the project people are doing is. I mean, are they sort of analyzing some concept that's there in the science that they think is in need of clarification, perhaps? Maybe. But a lot of the work is written in a much more metaphysical vein, where people purport to be telling you what this attribute really is or something. And secondly, whoops. Oh, no. Sorry, excuse me. Secondly, this literature, to my mind, is insufficiently integrated with biology, often based on overly simple models, and it sort of contains certain sort of technical shortcomings and statements that are not quite right or don't quite make sense. Now, in parallel to all of that, there's been this extensive discussion in theoretical biology over things such as what the correct definition of fitness is, and what the correct mathematical fitness measure is and why under various model assumptions. And one problem here is, and this is part of the interest, I think, is that it's not always obvious what correct really means here. Correct for, for what purpose? And so I think there are actually some subtle or semi-subtle conceptual issues here. Many of which have been sort of addressed by different people. But they're sort of not quite the same ones as the ones that people are discussing in philosophy of biology. So in short, you've ended up with these parallel literatures purportedly on the same topic, but not really making the contact with each other that they need to, and which is, I think, a problematic scenario that I hope to try and partially redress. I mean, the origins of all this talk of fitness lie, of course, in Darwin's notion of the fit of organisms and their traits to the conditions of life. Only later did he come to use the phrase survival of the fittest at Spencer's suggestion as a way of explaining what natural selection is meant to be all about, for better or worse. But in any case, later on, in 1920s and 30s, with the development of population genetics, the term fitness acquired a more specialized meaning, where genotype fitness came to be a term used for a parameter of the evolutionary models that the early population geneticists constructed, although many of them, in fact, didn't use that term at first. So Haldane tended not to use it much, and Fisher only in later work. But in any case, note well that for Darwin, this is an important point, I think, that fit was part of the explanandum, the thing to be explained. One of the things he wanted to explain was why there was this fit between the organism and the environment. That was the explanandum side. But fitness in the population genetic tradition and then in later evolution biology really belonged on the side of the explanans, the thing doing the explaining. So here the key distinction is between natural selection, the process, and fitness as a technical term in theoretical descriptions of that process, versus fitness as a term used to characterize the product of the process, the existence of phenotypic adaptation of well-adapted organisms. So the philosopher Ulrich Kroes captures this nicely by using the word fittedness for the former thing, the Darwin thing, versus fitness in the more modern sense. Although I won't follow his lead. So of course, fitness is a central concept in evolutionary biology today, and in many contexts is fairly unproblematic, I think. But it's also true to say that certain unclarities and ambiguities and disagreements can be found in the scientific literature on this. And it's not, to my mind, it's not really obvious why that is or how that could even be, given that the science mostly isn't really in dispute. And that's one thing I want to try and explain and to suggest an answer to. And this observation that the science isn't really in dispute leads me to the following sort of puzzle that, fitness, as everyone knows, is a key part of Darwinian evolution. You need fitness differences if you're going to get natural selection modifying a population, so adaptive evolution to occur, as we all know. And natural selection is a very well understood process, well studied empirically and theoretically. And one other thing we often say and read is that at root it's a fairly simple matter. It's really ultimately about one type having a higher growth rate than another. That seems to be what it boils down to. But then why is it that fitness is a contested concept? How can you square those things? So to put a bit of flesh on that, think of Richard Lewontin's famous tripartite analysis of the three conditions you need for evolution by natural selection. He said you need phenotypic variation, you need fitness differences, you need heritability. Well, think of George Price's famous covariance formulation, so-called, of evolution by natural selection, where essentially he's just putting in mathematical terms what Lewontin had said. I mean, it wasn't quite how he came to it, but that's essentially what he's doing, where he describes the change in the mean value of some phenotype in a population, it could be the population gene frequency, as in the simplest case, where you ignore inheritance as the covariance of the individual's value of that trait with this quantity called their fitness. And a striking thing to notice about this formulation, which some people treat as sort of encapsulating the essence of natural selection, of evolution by natural selection, is that the fitness term WI has a very simple definition. It just means the number of offspring that an individual contributes to the next generation. And no hint of any conceptual difficulty. And moreover, nor is there any latitude about how you might define the term if you want the equation to be true. I mean, other than that's a multiplication by a positive constant, of course. So it really seems that there's nothing problematic at all here about fitness or anything. And yet, you find in a famous quote, Steve Starnes writing in 1975 that fitness is something everyone understands but no one can define. Dawkins, in his extended phenotype book, had a chapter entitled An Agony in 5 Fits, in which he sort of delved into the multiple meanings of this horrendous term and indeed suggested that maybe the fitness concept, or at least the word, should be abolished. Earlier on, incidentally, J.B.S. Haldane's famous 1932 book, The Cause of Evolution, the penultimate chapter of that book is entitled What is Fitness? So I sort of started thinking about this. I thought, okay, I'll go back and see what the classic authors had to say on this. Striking thing about that chapter, although it contains much interesting material, he doesn't answer the question nor even address it. The book's just about something else. And that might reflect the fact that elsewhere Haldane was reputed to have said that fitness is a bugger. And what about if you look at other pioneers of modern evolution theory? So Fisher, in his famous 1930 book, he offered a definition of what he said is a definition of genotype fitness as simply Malthusian growth rate of the genotype. It's a per capita instantaneous rate of increase of the numbers of individuals with that genotype in continuous times. It's 1 over NDT, lauded by later contributors as a general and excellent definition of fitness, but always criticized by people too. And as recently as 2019, we found Warren Ewens, a population geneticist, saying that this is an unthinking aberration on Fisher's part. And essentially what he's getting at is that the rate at which a genotype increases in a population depends in a typical population in part on the rate at which individuals of that genotype arise through sexual reproduction and recombination, not just on the survival advantage of the genotype. And so therefore is intuitively not quite what we think fitness should be measuring. But in any case, the point I make for now is that the concept, although seemingly simple, seems to be contested. Or take another example, the seminal 1994 study of evolution in age-structured populations. Brian Charlesworth maintains that there's no such thing as a genotype's fitness in the general case, unless you make a lot of rather restrictive assumptions. Now, when you understand what he means by that, it's not really that puzzling, but at first blush, it's an odd statement. I mean, if evolution is all meant to be about some genotypes having more fitness than others, how could it be no such thing? Other controversies surrounding the notion of fitness maximization, the status of this concept and what exactly it means. And for some authors, it seems no more controversial than the existence of adaptation itself. And yet for others, a mistaken extrapolation from the simplest models where some sort of maximization principle holds true. And so something that we should be extremely wary of. And moreover, I mean, although I've talked about the fitness concept, at least if you take the evolution literature at face value, one might be inclined to say, look, there must be many such concepts because, I mean, we find a plethora of expressions for what appear to be fitness-like concepts, so terms such as genotype fitness, marginal allelic fitness, an individual's fitness, then specific measures such as lifetime reproductive success of an individual or the average for a type, intrinsic growth rate of a genotype or an allele, number of offspring but weighted by reproductive value, quantity called invasion fitness, celebrated by many authors as the sort of most general fitness concept. Notion of inclusive fitness, the topic of much confusion and debate, and then also notions of ecological fitness and others. So I think the only conclusion you can come to as a sort of outsider looking in on this discussion is that the term fitness is sort of polysemic in biology. It doesn't really seem to have a single exact meaning. And this then leads me to my project of trying to revisit the fitness concept. Sorry, someone's microphone is on in the audience, on the Zoom audience. Okay. If you could possibly mute it, thanks. This leads me to this project that I've been pursuing, which sort of aims in broad terms to integrate the philosophy and biology discussions, isolate what I take to be the real issues, explain how unclarity and ambiguity can arise, how the term fitness can be polysemic or somewhat ambiguous, despite the science not really being in dispute, and to resolve or at least shed some light on some of the many controversies surrounding the fitness notion that one sees in the scientific literature. And I have a forthcoming book on this with my co-author Bengt Outzen from the University College Cork in Ireland. Be hopefully out next year on this. What I want to do is sort of sketch some of the themes in the book. I have to move quite fast, I'm afraid. So, some things I say will really need more time, but there we are. So the guiding suggestion then is fitness is a theoretical concept. And what we mean by a theoretical concept broadly is one that's defined, concepts that, or terms that express them, that are defined by their theoretical role. And they're typically expressed by new terms, so not borrowed from the vernacular. I mean, fitness is perhaps an exception in that regard. But, in some cases, the term will be borrowed from the vernacular, but invested with a new meaning. So if you think of the term work in thermodynamics or something, obviously the vernacular meaning of that term isn't much use in understanding the scientific meaning. To understand terms that express theoretical concepts, it's not enough just to be given a definition, if such exists at all. Really, you need to learn the relevant body of theory in which the term is embedded. So understanding the term can't be separated from understanding the theory. A well-known theme in the philosophy of science. Now, you might say, well, that sounds nice, but maybe is that just metaphor? We'll just talk about it. Concept having a theoretical role. What does it really mean? And the answer is, well, no, it can be invested with very precise logical meaning. Carnap and Lewis in the mid-20th century show, building on this famous work by Frank Ramsey from early in the century. And I think of the sort of locus classicus of this tradition being Lewis's paper, How to Define Theoretical Terms. But it rests on a big presupposition. It isn't really true. The starting point of their investigation was the observation that scientific theories somehow seem to do two things at once. On the one hand, they advance empirical claims. That's the main point of any scientific theory, of course, say something about the world that may be true or false, and hopefully we can find out. But secondly, to implicitly define or imbue with meaning new vocabulary. Those are the theoretical terms of the science. And they sort of fretted a bit about that. Said, look, how's that possible? Because ordinarily, if you make an empirical claim, if I say, look, the honeybee population in England is declining or something, then the terms I use to make that statement have a pre-existing meaning. And it's because of that I can use them to make a specific scientific hypothesis. So how then could it be that some scientific theories, if you like, do two things at once, sort of both say something about the world and implicitly define completely new vocabulary? They said there's a problem, or there's something to be explained. And their answer basically is that a scientific theory, when formalized in a certain way, as a set of sentences in first-order logic, can in principle be split into two components, where theories, in a sense that can be made precise, logically equivalent to the conjunction of those two components, one of which embodies the empirical claim and the other the meaning-giving claim. In making this argument, they articulated the notion of theoretical role. That's what I want to draw. So to explain what they're doing, I mean, imagine that we have a new scientific theory that involves one new theoretical term, T. It introduces the term that wasn't previously used. It could be quark or something in physics. So then the first component of the theory says that there exists something in the world that satisfies a certain description. That's the empirical bit. The second component says that if there exists something that satisfies that description, then that thing is T. And then that allows us to define the term T as the unique entity satisfying the description in question, the role description of the term. So to illustrate, take the term gene in classical genetics. I mean, they formulated that idea. They were thinking of physics, but it really, in principle, applies anywhere. So take the term gene in classical genetics. Classical genetics, I mean the tradition associated with Morgan and the fruit flies, pre-molecular genetics, when it was breeding flies and looking at patterns of inheritance of traits. So let's suppose that gene was, which is distorting history only slightly, was a theoretical term of classical genetics. The role description of the term then is that a gene is something that is transmitted from parents to gametes, obeys the law of segregation, comes in variant forms, determines an aspect of phenotype, exhibits different degrees of linkage with other ones. And then a classical gene then is whatever it is that plays that role. It turns out to be, roughly speaking, length of protein coding DNA. So it's a unique entity, if there is one, that satisfies that role description. So that's the idea that a term can be defined by its role in a theory, by extracting this role description. Now, you see, the Carnap-Lewis approach presupposes, of course, that a scientific theory can be expressed in this form, in the so-called manner of the received view of scientific theories. Finite set of senses and first order logic plus their logical consequences. And that, as is well known, is a poor fit with most real science, and a sort of zero fit with most life science. I guess and so for that very reason, many philosophers these days are more attracted by the so-called model first or model-centric view of theories. Although it is worth here recalling Mary Williams' project, deducing the consequences of evolution, a mathematical model, where she really tried to axiomatize Darwinian theory in accordance with that old Carnap story, by taking the term fitness as an undefined primitive. And had that project worked, I mean, it doesn't quite work, but it was a valiant attempt, then you could have indeed applied the letter of the Carnap-Lewis approach. But you can't really apply that. So instead, we embrace this idea, or at least I do, that you should think of evolutionary theory as a family of models. Now, it may seem fairly obvious, given that you open books about evolution theory and you find indeed models in there. People have made models of it. A lot of people, do that for a living and then try and test them empirically. But the claim that the structure of the theory is that of a family of models isn't just meant to be the triviality that practitioners of the theory make models, but rather a claim about the source of the generality of the theory. Contrasts with the received view that you can isolate a scientific theory by writing down its core principles. And also, I think, contrasts with the attempt I mentioned, Price and Lewontin, to boil evolutionary theory down to certain key principles that encapsulate everything else in the manner of Lewontin, Price, Dawkins, and many others. So in short, then, the suggestion I have is to preserve the idea of terms being defined by their theoretical role, and the crucial distinction between the role of a term and the object that realizes the term, or the quantity that realizes that role. Sorry, the role of a scientific concept or term, and the object, property, or quantity that realizes that term, that role, rather. Sorry. But to drop the idea of a theory as an axiomatic system, and to rather embrace the notion of a theory as a family of models. So in short, then, to apply the spirit, but not the letter, of the Carnap-Lewis approach. That seems to me the way to go here. But how to actually do that? How to implement that in the case of this contested term fitness? Well, what we need to do then, I say, is to identify the theoretical role of the concept, the role that it plays in evolutionary theory. Not simply by looking at the usage of the word in the science, although obviously that's an important source of evidence, and nor by hunting for a definition, if such a thing could even be given in any, but rather by asking what job the concept does, and to then apply this philosophy that says, look, the definition of the concept is the thing that does that job. And here I note that many so-called definitions of fitness, given in both the philosophical and the evolutionary literature, are what I would actually call something else. They're not strictly speaking definitions. And here, incidentally, I think is where the philosophy of fitness missed a trick. In the one really good, useful contribution would have been to apply ideas from general logic and philosophy about the form of a definition and how one defines a concept to this particular debate, rather than just taking face value that what people call the definition of fitness in the evolutionary biological literature really was a definition sensu strict. Yeah, I was do I have time to have this really brief interlude? Yeah, maybe I'll go through it. And this is just to do two things. One, to illustrate sort of historically why it is that so many philosophers became to be interested in fitness. And secondly, to illustrate how crucial it is to look carefully at the theoretical role that the concept plays. So Popper in the 1960s and 70s had made this infamous argument that the survival of the fittest was a tautology, the fittest being defined simply as those that survive. So the core principle of evolutionary theory was a logical truism. The whole theory of evolution was, he said, a metaphysical research program in the pejorative sense of metaphysical. Now, a better version of the argument focuses on survival and reproduction, given that's what really matters. And this argument says, look, if you define fitness in terms of actual reproductive output or success, then tautology results, because the fittest types will predominate in the population, ceases to be an empirical claim, but a definitional one. Again, it looks like there's an apparent circularity at the heart of the theory. How then can the theory of evolution have any explanatory power? That's how people reasoned. This was the form of the argument that was taken up by Mills and Beattie, 1979 paper, that kicked off a lot of the philosophy of fitness. And they wrote the following. They said, clearly, we cannot say that the difference in fitness of A and B, those are meant to be heritable types, explains the difference in actual average offspring contribution between A and B when fitness is defined in terms of actual reproductive success. That seems quite right, just on the quite general grounds that nothing explains itself. And they continued, yet evolutionary biologists seem to think that, notice something very different here comes in, evolutionary changes can be explained by invoking the relative fitness of the types concerned. Now, there's a non sequitur in this paragraph, in this chain of reasoning, because they start by saying, well, if fitness is defined a certain way, then it can't do one thing. But then they go on to say, people seem to think that it does something else. Not the same thing at all. You see, explaining evolutionary change is one thing. Explaining why it is that one type has out-reproduced another type is a different thing. Those are not the same thing at all. So three standard reactions to this argument. One was to say, well, survival of the fittest is just a handy slogan, not the essence of evolutionary theory anyway. Second was to say, look, in a sense, it is tautological, but that doesn't really matter. And the third is to say, look, if you define fitness suitably, then the tautology is eliminated. And this led to the so-called propensity interpretation of fitness and a vast swathe of philosophical literature on that, some of which contains good ideas. However, you see, Mills and Beattie equivocated on the role that they think the fitness notion is meant to play. And as I see it, the rationale for invoking the notion of propensity has not been made out. And indeed, I say, even if you do define fitness in terms of actual reproduction, as sometimes people do, there is no thread of triviality. And incidentally, it's also worth noting that not every reference to the use of the phrase expected number of offspring in the context of evolutionary models really fits with the propensity idea at all, because you see they talked about propensity and then they switched. then they talked about probability. But when they talk in that paper about this expected number of offspring, what they do is they're not making clear what the source of the uncertainty is with respect to which they're taking expectation, and nor do they make clear what the model assumptions are that they're implicitly relying on, nor whether they're thinking that the probability of leaving different number of offspring is identical and independently distributed or not, or whether they're thinking of an environment that's stochastic. So there's really enormous problems with the discussion that they set up in that paper, as I see it. But they were right in one respect, in that they realized that this concept is meant to be doing a certain job, and they correctly appreciated that whether it can do that job, depends on what the job is and on how it's defined. So there was something right about what they did, but then I think it led people off on a wild goose chase. So anyway, that's an aside. Coming back to the role of fitness. Claim I want to make is that one can distinguish 4 different fitness roles or things that the concept is meant to do. The first is to serve as a measure of selective advantage. The second is to serve to predict evolutionary outcomes. The third is to serve as the determiner of evolutionary dynamics or of evolutionary change from one generation to another. The fourth thing is to serve as a measure of adaptiveness. So these are 4 different jobs, if you like, that the concept has been called on to play, or 4 different types of question that the concept is meant to help us answer. And you can, in a way, cluster them as, in a way, roles 2 and 4 go together, in that sometimes one is trying to predict the outcome of evolution precisely by finding some quantity that's maximized at the evolutionary equilibrium, and that serves to measure the adaptiveness of the different types that are in competition. So you can put 2 and 4 together. Alternatively, in another way of thinking about it, 1, 2, and 3 belong together because they describe the process of evolution by natural selection, where fitness is a term used in models of that process. On the other hand, you have role 4 that describes the product of that process. Fitness is used to characterize the explanandum of the theory, much as the way Darwin was using the term. And this then, of course, raises the question of which of any of these roles is privileged. And the answer, I think, is, well, none of them a priori. They're really just meant to answer different questions. But the basic idea that we want to argue for in our book is this, me and my co-author Bengt Outzen, that in any evolutionary model, one can ask whether a certain quantity definable from the model variables and parameters does or doesn't play one of the fitness roles. And the answer may be yes, or it may be no. It may be easy or difficult to ascertain, maybe in some cases obvious, some cases not. And the same quantity may in fact play more than one role. And in different models, one and the same role may in fact be realized or be played by different quantities. So here in this case, the thing that plays a role is a theoretically defined quantity in a theoretical model. There exist other fitness taxonomies, it's worth pointing out. A natural one that some people have used is to try and classify by the entity that has or bears the property of fitness. That's to say, by asking the question, the fitness of what? Motivated by the well-known observation that people sometimes talk about the fitness of an individual organism, sometimes that of a genotype, sometimes a gene or an allele, sometimes that of a whole population, sometimes a group. So, and this distinction incidentally cross-cuts our own. Say a little more about those 4 roles and why I think they're different. I mean, perhaps the simplest role of fitness is the first one, I think, where it's meant to measure selective advantage. So here's a way of thinking about it. Suppose you've got a population and a set of types in that population of different sorts of things. It could be genotypes or phenotypes or alleles or whatever. And then let's ask the question, let's suppose then that we have a real valued or numerical function on that set. And we want to say, well, what properties must it have in order for it to be a fitness function? And intuitively, I want to say at least these two properties. If the fitness of A, if type A exceeds that of B, then that means that natural selection favors A over B. If and only if, maybe, but there's a complication there. And a second is to say, well, look, if the fitness of all types is equal, no selection takes place. So fitness is something such that if all types have the same amount of it, no natural selection takes place. One has more of it than another, then selection favors the first. Now that's, those constraints are substantive if you know what selection means. But I say, look, just import an independently motivated definition of natural selection, such as something like differential reproduction that's not due to chance. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because you may say, well, differential reproduction over how many generations? And some people, incidentally, use the term selection in a stronger sense to impute a causal requirement, namely that the differential reproduction should arise because of the difference in type, not merely that it not be due to chance. But in any case, if you grant just that much, then one can sensibly say, in a particular evolutionary model, does a certain quantity realize the first role or not? So take, for example, the probability of surviving to reproductive age. Under some model assumptions, that quantity will indeed satisfy those two principles I have in the previous slide. But under other model assumptions, for example, if there are differences in fecundity, then it won't. That's the first and sort of simplest notion, I guess. Second notion is that a fitness measure is meant to predict the evolutionary outcome, where an outcome might be, in the simplest case, the fixation of one type and the elimination of others, or maybe a polymorphic equilibrium, or possibly something else, some non-equilibrium state or something. Intuitively, the idea here is just that the fitter types are meant to be the ones that prevail in evolutionary competition, other things being equal, of course. So that it's not an accident if the fittest types prevail in evolutionary competition. Right? There's some intrinsic definitional connection. How to make that precise depends on the context. It depends on what prediction means and what outcome means, on whether we assume deterministic or stochastic evolutionary dynamics, and on whether we're talking about a frequency-dependent scenario or not. But in short, that's the second idea, that the fittest type in a population is meant to be the one that will win out in evolutionary competition, so long as, an earthquake doesn't wipe everyone out or something. Role 3 is that fitness is meant to be the determiner of evolutionary dynamics. Motivation here is the idea that, well, evolution's all about frequency change. So surely a fitness function, one thing it should enable us to do is to convert old frequencies into new. So if we let pt be the frequency of a type at time t, pt plus 1 is its new frequency. Ideally, the change between them, delta p, change from old frequency to new, should be determined by the fitness function. If we knew the fitness of all the competing types and other things being equal, that should determine the new frequency from the old, given the state of the population at time t. You might say, is that really different from the first role? Well, I say, yeah, it is, yeah. Because you see, the first one is about selection, and the third is about evolutionary change. Another point to observe is that the first role, at least if governed only by those two constraints I mentioned, is purely ordinal. And that's never the case for this third role. The fourth fitness role is that of measure of adaptiveness. So this ties in with the Darwinian notion of fit of organism to environment, and fitness meant to be a measure of how well adapted an organism or a type of organism is to its environment. Now, you might say, look, is that really a true fitness role at all? You might say, look, maybe adaptiveness is better captured by some sort of performance metric that'll, depend on the species and the trait under consideration. You might think, you've got some metric that tells you how well a crab's carapace protects the innards or something, and that enables you compare crabs according to that metric, and then that's the measure of how well adapted their carapaces are. And that would presumably be empirically related to fitness in one of the other three in the sense of one of the other three roles. However, although you might be attracted by that, I think it's true to say that the idea that adaptation or apparent design corresponds to fitness maximization is still very much alive in evolutionary biology today. And then some authors treat this as the sort of central point of Darwinism. So I do think to be true to the sort of science as we see it, you do have to take seriously the idea that fitness is in part a measure of adaptiveness, rather than just a term that features in theoretical models of the process of things becoming adapted. Okay, now in the simplest case, all of those roles coincide in the sense that one and the same quantity realizes all of them, so you don't really see the difference between them. And I think that what's happened is that implicitly, I think certainly in philosophy and in some biological quarters too, I think people have implicitly generalized from the simplest case, if you like, or people have gone beyond it. The complex, we've moved from the simple to complex cases without appreciating the different roles, and that's led to people sort of talking past each other a bit. The simplest case, as I see it, involves a large population of haploid asexual organisms of two types, frequencies p and 1 minus p, with discrete non-overlapping generations, perfect true breeding of the types, so no mutations, no age nor class structure, so all the organisms apart from type are just identical with each other. Environment's fixed, so there's no stochasticity. And then we can simply take the per capita number of offspring of type I, so its so-called absolute fitness, maybe assume the constant over generations, a fixed quantity, not a random variable. So there's no frequency or density dependence. Far too simple to be of any interest or even to be worth treating mathematically. Well, to my mind, the conceptually simplest case of evolution by natural selection. And in that case, it's straightforward to show that this quantity, the per capita number of offspring produced by a type, realizes all four fitness roles. In that if A has more of it than B, selection favors A over B. They're equal and there's no selection, where selection is independently defined. The type with the highest value of that quantity will eventually fix in the population. We can write an equation expressing the frequency of the type at a later time as a function of its previous frequency, given that we know the fitness function. So fitness is exactly the information you need to know in addition to the initial frequency to determine the later frequency. And WI is a very natural measure of how adapted a type is, or an organism of that type. Why do I say that last comment? Well, because at equilibrium, all individuals are of the type that achieves the maximal value of that function. And indeed, the population mean of WI is maximal with respect to all possible population compositions too. So the Darwinian idea that natural selection leads to adaptation is vindicated then if you take the per capita number of offspring, WI, the type I, as a measure of adaptiveness. So in that simplest possible case, then fitness is very simple. There's nothing really to discuss. One and the same quantity plays all these roles. However, I claim that in more complicated cases, a single quantity definable from model parameters might not realize all four fitness roles. And also, a given role might be realized by different quantities depending on model assumptions. And this, I think, accounts for why the term became sort of ambiguous polysemic in the science, that as people sort of generalized from the logically simplest case of Darwinian natural selection to the cases that are of interest to evolution theorists, then some people prioritize one role over some another. So one illustration of that, one sort of source of additional complexity, is one brings class structure into play, as in a lot of modern evolution theory, where individuals belong to different classes. Could be age classes, could be sex, could be their size at a particular time, their energy reserves. Where a class is just any way of partitioning up the populations, and then means that individuals vary with respect to both type and class. complicates evolutionary analysis, as is well known. So number of offspring then is no longer necessarily a very good measure of an individual or a type's fitness, because the offspring can be of different classes. You might leave offspring of different quality, for example. So just counting up how many of them isn't necessarily going to be a useful measure. So one solution, going way back to Fisher, is that what you need to do is introduce a weighting scheme where you weight the number of offspring individual leaves by something called their reproductive value, where that is a quantity that attaches to the different classes. And then fitness is sometimes then defined as reproductive value weighted number of offspring. But then this raises the question, why? Well, who says that? I mean, firstly, how exactly are you defining reproductive value? Big long story about that. But also why? If you do that weighting, then what, this quantity, which of the roles does it play? And that then becomes a non-trivial question. Another source of complexity comes when you think of cases where the environment varies stochastically, for example, over generations. And one measure of a genotype's fitness in that case is the geometric mean over the randomly varying environment of a type's per capita number of offspring, or its sort of finite rate of increase. So the point is here that what we were calling WI is now a random quantity, not a fixed one. And a very natural thing to do is to consider the geometric mean over the random environment and to let that equal the genotype's fitness. And that measure will, under standard model assumptions, certainly realize role 2 in the long run, and it'll predict the outcome. That's why people think it's a good fitness measure. If you want to know which type will eventually predominate, that's the thing you need to know. That's what you want to work out. So that's fitness. However, it doesn't realize role 3, that it doesn't determine the generation by generation dynamics, that quantity. Whether it realizes role 1 is subtler, depends on how you define things. And indeed, it's somewhat unclear whether it plays role 2 over finite time periods or not. That's a sort of subtle, tricky theoretical question. Another source of complexity, of how the concept of fitness becomes complexified when you go beyond the simple case, arises from consideration of finite populations, where there's been interesting recent debates about what the right fitness measure is here. So a quantity that the evolutionist John Gillespie advocated, that a number of philosophers picked up on, was to take the mean of an individual's reproductive output and subtract the variance divided by the population size, produce this quantity here in the context of a finite population, which obviously, as the population gets larger and larger, just becomes the expected reproductive output. But in the case where n is appreciable, then where n is small, then this could be the variance divided by n could be a non-negligible quantity, and produce a lot of philosophical discussion. But I think the crucial thing you have to notice here is that this quantity, in a sense, plays role 2, in that you can predict that if 2 alleles are initially at the same frequency, the one with a higher value of this has a higher probability of fixing in the population. And that's the justification for considering that measure. But it's certainly not true that this measure is a measure of selective advantage in the sense in which I defined it, nor that it is what you need to know if you want to work out the expected frequencies in the next generation from the current generation. And indeed, on these grounds, the evolutionist Thomas Hansen, in a recent-ish paper, has insisted that Gillespie's measure is not really a definition of fitness at all, should never have been called that, and that all the philosophers who thought of it that way, following Gillespie himself, were wrong, because he's not disputing the science here. He's just saying, look, the quantity doesn't do the thing that we want a fitness concept to do. And the dispute boils down essentially to the question of whether you want a measure of fitness to determine the expected change in a type frequency from one generation to another in short term, or whether you want it to predict the ultimate evolutionary outcome. And so essentially this debate stems precisely from the fact that one of the authors wants fitness to do one job, role 2, predict the outcome. The other wants fitness to determine the evolutionary dynamics. And so they end up disputing what the right mathematical definition of fitness, although I say that's not really strictly a definition anyway, is. So the science isn't in dispute. They just want the concept to do different things because they've generalized beyond the simple case in different ways. So I'll skip this last slide. Just to, talk quickly about age-structured populations. I mentioned that before when I talked about Brian Charlesworth. So the usual way of thinking about age-structured populations is to consider the survival and fecundity of a genotype as a function of its age. So it depends on age to take account of overlapping generations. So here we let Lx of a type I and Mx of type I denote respectively the probability of surviving to reproductive age and the number of offspring you produce if you do. And then what then should be the definition of the genotype's overall fitness? Well, under some assumptions, if we consider the intrinsic rate of increase R of the genotype, which can be defined in terms of this, implicitly defined in terms of the vital rates, Li and Mi, under some assumptions that will indeed realize role 2, in that we can predict that the type with the highest value of that quantity will eventually take over the population. But in the general case, this is the result of Charlesworth I mentioned before, no single number is a genotype's fitness. And that explains what he means by saying that there's no such thing as a genotype's fitness. But it doesn't mean there's any ambiguity about what natural selection is, because you see natural selection and the measure of selective advantage just needs to be made age-specific, if you like. So the measure that plays role 1 it has got to be indexed by age. And when he says there's no such thing as a genotype's fitness, that's because he's thinking of it as something that plays these other roles, roles 2 and 3. That's why I say it's crucial to distinguish between these fitness roles. Life history theory, fascinating controversy. Now in reality resolved, but it's still of interest about the right fitness measure in the use of the optimality models that life history theorists were developing in the 1990s, where some authors seem to be implicitly making the argument that the life history we expect to evolve will be the one that maximizes this quantity R, the intrinsic rate of increase. Whereas others were making the argument that no, the life history evolves will maximize this different quantity, the net reproductive rate, which is just really the expected number of offspring an organism leaves. The difference between these two measures being that this one takes into account how quickly you produce offspring, and this only just counts up how many of them there are. And under some conditions, then some assumptions, that makes a big difference. And in general, these are not ordinarily equivalent. So if you choose the one that comes out top by one of those criteria, it won't come up top by the other. So it seems really odd that people could be disagreeing about this. But it turned out this was really resolved in a landmark paper by Milius and Diekman in 1995. That, I mean, essentially what was going on was that the people engaged in this debate about which of these was the right measure and modeling things in different ways were making implicitly different assumptions about how the population's density is being regulated. So this is a case where they were making different model assumptions rather than invoking different fitness roles. Another source of complication, of course, is frequency dependence, and many evolutionary models these days take account of the fact that the survival of an organism of a given type may well depend on how common that type is in the population. This leads then to the notion of invasion fitness that Milius and Diekman were using to resolve that previous issue, where the invasion fitness refers to the growth rate of a mutant in an environment set by a resident. So the assumption here is that the population is monomorphic apart from the appearance of a rare mutant. The mutant pops up, and then we consider its growth rate and compare that to the resident's own growth rate to determine what's going to happen, whether it can be invaded or not. That's the question one's typically interested in an evolutionary game theory. It's not to try and study the generation by generation dynamics, but just figure out what's going to happen eventually. And this has led to the notion advocated by Hans Metz in a number of seminal works, who I think is in the audience today, that invasion fitness is the master fitness concept. That Hans has defended that notion. And I think in many ways he's right, but it is important to see that what's going on here is that fitness is being called on to do a specific job, namely basically to predict the evolutionary outcome. That's the point of the invasion fitness notion, not to do the job that fitness was meant to be doing in the models of the population geneticists. So I say it realizes roles 2 and 4, but not role 3. And then finally brings me on to inclusive fitness. I won't say much about this. I'm sure many people have come across the vexing controversies about this notion used in models of kin selection, arising from Hamilton's observation, or Darwin's observation, I guess, that so altruistic organisms are clearly not maximizing their personal fitness. They're sacrificing it to help someone else. So what are they doing then? Is there some other quantity perhaps that they're maximizing? Well, yes, says Hamilton and his modern followers, some more complicated measure that takes into account kin and inclusive fitness, this influential but controversial debate, leading to all sorts of controversies that still rumble on today. I mean, perhaps they shouldn't, but whether inclusive fitness is well defined. And here the question that I think that is of interest to ask is to say, well, what role does this concept play? What's it meant to do? And the striking thing is that Hamilton's modern followers all seem attracted by the idea that it plays role 4. It serves as a measure of how well adapted an organism's social behavior is. And it allows us to sort of rescue the idea that individuals maximize some quantity through their behavioral choices from the threat posed to that idea by the existence of altruistic behavior. Debatable, I think, because the most general argument, as I see it, really only shows that it plays role 3, that you can write an equation for if you define inclusive fitness suitably under suitable model assumptions for the change in frequency of an allele from one generation to the other in terms of this quantity called inclusive fitness. But that's really only showing that it plays role 3, not that it plays role 4. Anyway, a lot more could be said about that. But the more general prediction that my scheme makes is that there are two possible reasons why people could disagree about fitness. And it seems so simple, then it gets more complicated. There are 2 possible sources of disagreement. And the first is that there's a disagreement about roles. So people are talking past each other because some people are assuming that fitness is whatever does this job. Someone else is saying, no, fitness is whatever does that job. In the simplest cases, the same thing does both jobs. In more complicated cases, that's not so. And that explains one source of disagreement. Disagreements of type 2 arise even when both parties are thinking about the same role. They want fitness to do the same thing, but they're making either explicitly or implicitly different model assumptions that lead one of them to say fitness is X and the other fitness is Y. And these are fundamentally different. I say there's no other possibility, in fact, unless one party is just wrong. And this then, I think, sheds light on many debates in the biological literature and on some of the philosophy debates too. I mentioned, here's a few examples of these debates. I've mentioned this one of little r versus R0 as the optimality criterion in life history models, inclusive fitness or not, this notion of Fisherian fitness that I mentioned earlier, Fisher's controversial definition of genotype fitness in his 1930 book, the idea of weighting number of offspring by reproductive value and why. One I haven't mentioned, though, this interesting debate in quantitative genetics about whether an organism's fitness should depend on how well its offspring survive. Because, sometimes people say that. They say, it's not just about producing offspring, it's surviving offspring. It's no good producing them, if they just die. Okay, but survive for how long? Up to reproductive age, or just for the first year or so until their weaning is complete in mammals. But why? You see many ways you could define it, but why? Is there a principled answer to that? Turns out the answer is yes, but to extract the principled answer, you have to precisely attend to the question of what job do you want the definition of fitness to do. I mentioned this debate about whether geometric mean fitness in the context of stochastic environments is a good measure or not, and the question of whether fixation probability is the right measure of an allele's fitness in finite population models. And then invasion fitness is a master concept. So in short, then my conclusions are as follows: that I think the fitness concept is indeed a bit subtle, because you see, it's not an ordinary phenotypic property, just like an organism's height or something, in the sense that it's meant to play a certain role in the theory. And that's why I say it's a theoretical concept. In fact, I say it plays multiple roles that need to be actually distinguished. And so the role realizer distinction from philosophy becomes crucial. I think of the philosophical discussion, maybe this is a bit sweeping, as sort of largely misplaced, partly because it's based on simple models where, in fact, the concept, I think, is unproblematic. But in more complex cases, I think the concept becomes a little bit more problematic, precisely because different quantities realize different roles, and that this explains some of these vexing fitness disagreements in the literature, and explains more generally how it is that the term could be polysemic or ambiguous, even though the underlying science isn't really in dispute. And also explains why no single mathematical fitness measure is the right one in every model. And I think explains the plethora of fitness-like quantities at work in evolutionary biology, which can seem really confusing and perplexing at first sight, and explains why the concept remains somewhat unclear. So I say that the philosophy of fitness of a sort is sort of possible, but I don't think that the issues on which we should be focusing it are really exactly those discussed in the philosophical literature, old or new. But however, I think the philosophy of science really does help here, I hope, in that I think these two philosophical ideas that I sort of export from a different context and put to work here. The first one is evolutionary theory is a family of models, not as a set of laws or an axiomatic system or something like that. And the second one is fitness as a theoretical concept, so something implicitly defined by the job it does, rather than as something we want to define by giving necessary and sufficient conditions. And you take those two ideas, you put them together, and that gives you the framework, I say, that does help you understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samir. Again, apologize for the technical difficulties in the first. We started. We have about 17 minutes for discussion, so I would recommend short questions and short answers if possible. So, do you have one?
It's a personal
Oh.
So last century I was taught as a plant breeder, so I had a lot of genetics, genetics. In the 20th century, there was a part of biology talking about genetics, they were talking about choice equation. And I never knew that. So it was a big surprise to me. Why?
We talk about that.
Choice equation doesn't exist in my plant breeder experiment. So for me, it's two worlds.
Yeah. I mean, I think that. Samir, can you quickly rephrase the question, because I don't think people on Zoom.
Okay. So sorry. So for everyone's benefit, then the question comes from someone who used to work as a plant geneticist in the last century, and is now a philosopher. Oh, that was your words. Now works as a philosopher of science, and it was struck by the fact that people discuss the price equation when they talk about evolution in philosophy of science. But you never heard of that in the context of plant breeding and genetics. Yeah, I mean, I think there is in fact a connection in that. I mean, the quantitative genetics, if you think of the so-called breeder's equation of quantitative genetics, I don't know if that was so much used in plant genetics, in plant breeding, but could have been, which is one of the core formulations of quantitative genetics. In fact, bears a very intimate, simple relationship with the price equation. So it could have done. Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure I would have thought the more theoretically inclined ones might be. I mean, all of this obsession with the price equation, I think, stems from the fact that one thing we've often wanted to do in philosophy generally is sort of seek the most general abstract definitions and things and say, okay, boil it all down to its essence. What does it all come down to? You see that impulse in Dawkins and Dennett to say, look, strip away all the window dressing. What's the essence of natural selection? And arguably, if you want something that is a quantitative expression of that essence, that's something like the price equation. That's not to say it's very useful in practice. It isn't. It's. In a way, it's just a definition of truth, right? Yes, I'm not on. I would have been more surprised if you told me they had heard of it. To be honest. Yeah.
I have a simple question about the desirability of the four roles. You didn't say much on that. Maybe one is not useful, and therefore the misalignment between 1, 2, and 3, and 4, for example, is not important if 4 is in fact irrelevant. You didn't say much on that. Do you believe that all the four roles are useful?
It's a good question. Yeah, certainly the first 3, and that reflects the fact that there are different questions one can ask about an evolving population. You might say, where's it going to end up eventually? You might say, where's it going to go from now? What's it going to look like a generation hence? Or in the next time step or something, or over a short time period. In parts, you've got those 2 different questions. Also, you might want to tie fitness to natural selection, as I do in role 1, and also insist that term has a causal meaning, not just a correlation or what. In part, I think that there are just different questions you can ask, and so under different sort of model assumptions, then one and the same quantity won't answer both of them. But the 4th one is maybe a bit different in that that's really, whether we should think of adaptiveness and fitness as intrinsically conceptually related or not is perhaps a bit more debatable. I think I am open to the suggestion that says, no, that's not a valid fitness role at all. But I think of my job here as a sort of philosophical anthropologist of the science, really to make sense of as much of the science as I see. So when I read people, for example, like Alan Graffin and his followers, for whom the notion of fitness maximization is so critical, and they want to say, well, we like that because that's how you express the notion, how you formally express the notion of adaptiveness, then I want to sort of include, to make sense of as much as possible. So to be inclusive, but there's certainly grounds for that, for saying, look. And I think actually in the last chapter of my book, then my co-author and I have this section where we sort of say, look, can you imagine a counterfactual history where Spencer hadn't said to Darwin, what about this nice phrase, survival of the fittest? What would it have looked like then? Could you just have had different words, more explicitly, more specialized vocabulary for use in different evolutionary models, like invasion experiment or something, or whatever, where you said explicitly what you meant each time, and there wouldn't have been this huge kerfuffle about fitness. Is that possible? Or was the ambiguity created? Tying in with the discussion we were having this morning.
And do you answer the question, or you just raised it?
Raise it, dude. Well, raise it, yeah. Because I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because you do. Sorry, I'll let other people ask their questions. Yeah.
I was wondering. I feel like for this specific question, it's a very, very satisfying answer, maybe, or at least like a proposition. Do you think it's also a framework that could be applicable to other conceptual debates?
I do. Yeah, good. No, I do, and I insinuated that when I said that I think philosophy of fitness sort of missed a trick by not drawing on this very interesting work on on implicit definition of how terms are implicitly defined by their role in a theory. Partly just because it came from a sort of corner of analytic philosophy that didn't seem to have much to say to philosophy of biology. But I think it's a nice illustration of why sometimes in philosophy of life sciences, we do need to really draw on the analytic philosophy tradition when it's got something concrete to offer. do I think the role realizer story can be used elsewhere? Yeah, I do. I do, because I think and I think implicitly people do use that. I mean, it's not so much meant to be a revisionary suggestion as sort of making more explicit a way of reasoning that people probably quite often use when they say, well, what job do we want this concept to do? So, for example, I mean, think of just off the top of my head, I think this interesting discussion about the concept of race that people have had in philosophy of science. Is race a good category or not? Is it scientifically valid? Is it just a troublesome, socially constructive notion? That whole debate. I mean, one way you might try and get a handle on that is to say, well, what job is that concept really meant to do? Is it just, is its role just to reinforce, colonial hierarchies, or is its job to do something in the science or something? And I think people were implicitly using this role thinking in phylogenetic systematics when way back in the debates between cladists and the evolutionary taxonomists and phoneticists back in the history of taxonomy in the 70s, where they were sort of saying, well, what job do you want a taxonomy to do? Okay, you've divided things up into these categories, but what's that for? And that's essentially employing a sort of informal version of the same methodology I've been using here, I think. So in short, I think it is a potentially fruitful methodology. Yeah, I hope.
We have 3 questions on Zoom, but there is priority for people in the room, especially if you're young. And just the way, do you feel young? This is the only criterion we use it. So please, if you have any questions in the room, that would be great. So maybe, Samir, you want to take questions on Zoom?
Yeah,
this is
if I can hear them. Yeah.
Several hands.
Perhaps Joanna Mazer would like to go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah,
I also put it in the chat. Can you hear me? Otherwise, somebody can read it in the chat.
Let me I can hear you. Yeah, I mean, I think if you talk loudly, everyone, I can hear you. I hope others can. I can read the question to the room.
Okay, I did put it in the chat if you want to read it if people can't hear. So generally, I love the idea of taking fitness to be, on the basis of how biologists use it. As a biologist, I'm great, keen on that one. But the way I see that we use it is every model has at least 2 fitness definitions in it, one of which we assign by saying, let the fitness of this genotype be this, and another one which we derive, like here is the long-term outcome, like, simply from, one generation fitness to geometric mean fitness, and then you reach a conclusion relating to roles. And so the idea of saying which role in the singular is going on, I would argue that in any good model, there's at least 2 roles going on, and the model is about the relationship between them. And that's true, like your simplest example, which had only every role being equal, you only need to add finite population size, and you actually get the model of Haldane 1927, which he did usefully use to relate absolute reproductive outcome to probability of fixation of a beneficial allele. And so you've got 2 things in relationship to each other.
Yeah. No, but that's precisely when you go beyond the simple case. Exactly. I mean, that's precisely right. So you have those 2 quantities in that case, the probability of fixation and the genotype fitness, and a relationship between them under certain assumptions, obviously a approximate relationship under certain assumptions. All of that, I mean, I think is exactly right, and I'm on board with. The only thing I'm not sure I agree with, John, is the first thing you said when you said you start off by writing down a definition of a genotype fitness. You see, that's an example, I think, of the thing that you certainly start by doing something like that, and you might call it a definition, but I say that isn't really a definition, but rather a modeling assumption, a statement of the form, in this model, we are going to take it.
Assignation. Let this be equal to that.
Right.
Whether that doesn't have to be a definition, but yeah, an assignation is the word I'd use.
Yeah, no.
And then there's a derivation, and the assignation and the derivation are in relationship with each other across different fitness concepts.
Mm-hmm. No, that seems entirely right. Although, I also think it's worth noting that, you could just use the word for one of those things, if you see what I mean. So, I have read that Haldane paper and know the result, but my memory is that he usually talks about the selective coefficient. And does he even use the word in that paper, or does he just talk about probability of fixation and selective coefficient?
Too early, yeah. The
Yeah,
words were different in 1927.
the words are
It's
different.
too early.
Absolutely. Yeah, but no, I certainly agree with you that you've got two different quantities playing different roles and that may be related, and that you're saying that in an important class of cases, maybe all the point of the model is to relate them.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
That's interesting, although I do wonder about the generality of that bit. I'm sure that there are sort of really important examples, but the generality of that bit is the bit I'd like to think about more, about whether that's true of every case, if you like. But thanks, that's really useful, and I'll follow up with you by email. Okay, so we've got a question. The first one on my screen here is, sorry, I can't read the name. I've one from Ingrid
Forsdyke.
Forsdyke, yeah.
Could I? Yes.
When you go.
I like your emphasis on many levels of many roles to be played, but I think one of the problems is when you said early on, science is mostly not in dispute. In fact, there has been a major dispute about speciation and the role that genes play in speciation and the way of the chromosomes play in speciation. And most of the debate involves and also about natural selection is about genes. And in fact, taking an example, you didn't mention the word mutation. Well, this is quite important in this discussion. When you get down into the mud, you have mutations are doing all the stuff which evolution is about. And a mutation might, for example, make you run a bit faster so a predator can't catch you, and that would improve your reproductive success. But that very same mutation that changes your chromosomes just a little bit, and these chromosomes mutations can build up to an extent that you cannot reproduce properly. That is, you will cross with someone and your child will have your chromosomes and your partner's chromosomes. And when that child reproduces, those two chromosomes are going to come together and try and repair defects in each other. And if they're not good at repairing each other, then your reproductive success is going to go down. So a mutation which appears to be improving you regarding natural selection, escaping from predators, is removing you from the population because downstream it doesn't work well with reproductive partners. This is the basis of chromosomal speciation, and I've been working on this for about at least 3 decades. Most people talk about GC, base composition. There are 2 items of DNA. One is the sequence and one is the base composition. And they talk about GC as being upsetting the calculation. In fact, it's of ultimate importance in chromosomal speciation, and you have to break it down to k-mers. And the latest progress in this field is describing little oligonucleotides, strings of 5 or 6 nucleotides, which are the key elements which allow you to reproduce properly. And if they get screwed up, then your reproduction is going to fail. So that is probably, I think, the basis of one role which you have to consider in your deliberations.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, when I said that there's no disagreements in the science, I mean, I didn't mean that everything in evolutionary biology is settled, obviously, or that there's nothing for anyone to do. But what I meant is that, I mean, if you sort of take at first blush, then all this idea that this fundamental sort of concept is impossible to define or is impossible to pin down. It makes it sound as if, well, you couldn't help thinking, look, if that's really true, why isn't there a crisis at hand in evolutionary biology, but there isn't. It's in fact it's in fact fairly clear in these examples that I've been talking about what's going on. I mean, obviously there can be important empirical and theoretical controversies, and I'm sure there are. I wasn't meaning to downplay that, but rather to try and explain what to me is this puzzling phenomenon that people can, in the same breath, say, "Oh, we can't understand or define this notion. There's a billion different definitions, and we can't pin it down," while also saying, "Well, it's the core notion in the theory." And yet there isn't. I mean, if that's really true, it would seem that there's a big problem, but there isn't. So it was trying to shed light on that nexus of questions that it was in that context I made my comment about the science not being in dispute. But thanks for your observation. Okay, we've got another question coming in from, or maybe we don't.
I don't think so. I think it was.
Okay.
I'm not sure she had a question.
Comments in the chat, though, right?
No. This is Joanna's question that I think.
There's 12 comments there.
Well, yeah, the comments were about people seeing the presenters move. Okay, Fabien has a question. Fabien, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Final question. Yes.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you did not really mention it in this call, but do you see the distinction between interpreting fitness as a theoretical concept or as a real-world attribute, making an important difference in some contexts, like for suggesting different research orientations to answer specific questions in evolutionary biology, or different strategies for intervening in an ecosystem, for instance?
Yeah. So you see, I do think that's an important issue, and indeed we discussed that in our forthcoming book quite a bit, about whether you want to think of fitness as a real world attribute in the sense that there's a fact, an objective scientific fact about the fitness of a flesh and blood individual organism, for example. Is that the right way to think about it? I say no. I mean, clearly, if a flesh and blood organism, there's a fact about how long it lives, how many offspring it leaves, presuming it's clear when death occurs, and what counts as reproduction. Now, obviously, in some contexts, you might problematize those, but leave that aside, just sort of think basic sort of case. Is there a fact about its probability of surviving a certain age? Maybe. Depends on your views about single case probability and other stuff. But anyway, leave all of that aside. I say the wrong way to think about the fitness concept is that there's an objective fact about the fitness of a flesh and blood organism. I don't think there has to be, really. It seems to me that it's a concept at work in scientific models, and the usual story about how models represent the world applies here. Namely, a model makes certain assumptions and idealizing assumptions, and roughly those assumptions may roughly hold true of a real world system or not. But it's not the case that every model quantity, if you like, is directly representational as some real world counterpart. So, and I want to indeed say that you don't need to assume that. Yeah, so I think that one of the problems that arose from not taking the model-centric perspective seriously enough was this notion that there must be some objective fact about the fitness of a flesh and blood organism, not a modeled organism, but a real flesh and blood one. I say I don't really see any reason to make that assumption. I think you can make sense of the way the concept functions scientifically without that, let's say.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I think it's time to thank Samir. Thank you very much for that. Keep in mind that tomorrow, Benjamin Spada is defending his PhD at 2 p.m. So if you want to see Samir again, it's happening tomorrow, 2 p.m. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Don't you go and